The steel wheels of the commuter train screamed against the iron rails, a high-pitched mechanical shriek that cut through the humid night air of the Hudson Valley. It was a sound that usually meant progress, movement, the rhythm of a city expanding and breathing. But on this specific night in the mid-1930s, that sound was the soundtrack to a nightmare. Inside one of the carriage cars, the air wasn't filled with the usual smoke of commuters or the quiet hum of conversation. It was filled with terror. A woman, her uniform pressed but now disheveled, her hands trembling, was surrounded. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a runner. She wasn't a lieutenant in the armies of the night that fought for control of Manhattan's uptown streets. She was domestic staff. She was a nanny. She was a woman who made her living caring for a home, ensuring that the domestic sphere of a very powerful, very dangerous man remained a sanctuary of peace in a world of war. But the men surrounding her didn't care about sanctuary. To them, she was a message, a pawn on a chessboard that had been soaked in blood for months. They dragged her toward the space between the cars, the wind whipping through the open gangway, the ground rushing by beneath them at 50 miles per hour in a blur of gravel and darkness. She pleaded. She invoked God. She invoked the rules that said civilians, women, children, the help, were off limits. But the men who held her were desperate. They were losing a war against a ghost, a man they couldn't catch, couldn't kill, and couldn't break. So they decided to break his heart instead. They decided to show him that his reach didn't extend everywhere. They threw her. The body hit the gravel with a violence that no human frame was meant to withstand. The train didn't stop. The men didn't look back. They returned to the city, confident that they had sent a letter that couldn't be ignored. They thought they had struck a blow that would induce fear. They thought they had proven that Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was vulnerable. What they didn't realize, what they couldn't possibly comprehend in their arrogance, was that they hadn't induced fear. They had induced an apocalypse. They hadn't exposed a weakness. They had unlocked a level of brutality that the Harlem underworld had never seen before and would never forget. They had violated the sanctity of the home. And when Bumpy Johnson found out, he wouldn't just send a message back. He would leave no mercy. This is the story of the sovereign of Harlem. This is the story of the man who walked between the raindrops, the man who wrote poetry in the dark and slit throats in the light. This is the story of what happens when you cross the line with the Godfather. Harlem, 1935. The news didn't travel by telephone, not the news that mattered. It traveled by whisper. It moved through the beauty parlors on 125th Street, through the pool halls where the cigarette smoke hung low and blue, through the jazz clubs where the saxophones cried out the pain of a generation. The whisper reached the ears of Junie Bird first. Junie, the short, cigar-chomping confidant who stood by Bumpy's side through every war, every truce, and every prison sentence. Junie's face, usually a mask of cynical amusement, went pale. He knew the rules, he knew the code, and he knew what Bumpy was capable of when the code was broken. Bumpy Johnson was sitting in a booth at the back of a club, perhaps the Rhythm Club or maybe Small's Paradise, watching the room with those heavy, lidded eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He was a man of contrasts. He held a book of philosophy in one hand and a glass of expensive scotch in the other. He wore suits that cost more than a factory worker made in a year, tailored to hide the jagged bumps on the back of his head that gave him his name, and to hide the strapless holster that carried his equalizer. When Junie approached the table, Bumpy didn't look up. He turned a page. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Junie," Bumpy said, his voice a low rumble, calm, measured, the voice of a professor, not a killer. "It's bad, Bump," Junie said. He sat down, leaning in close. The music in the club seemed to fade away, the clinking of glasses dampening as the atmosphere at the table shifted. They grabbed the girl. The nanny. Bumpy stopped reading. He closed the book slowly, placing it on the table with deliberate care. He didn't slam it. He didn't flip the table. Bumpy Johnson rarely exploded, he imploded, becoming denser, harder, colder. "Grabbed?" he asked. "She was on the train," Junie whispered, his voice cracking. "They threw her off, Bump, while it was moving." For a long time there was silence. The kind of silence that happens in the eye of a hurricane. The kind of silence that exists in a courtroom right before the judge passes a death sentence. Bumpy Johnson looked at his hands. Hands that had shuffled cards, written poems about the plight of the Negro in America, and hands that had utilized a straight razor with the precision of a surgeon to carve his name into the history of New York. She was family, Bumpy said. It wasn't a question. It was a definition. In Bumpy's world, you didn't have to be blood to be family. If you ate at his table, if you looked after his home, if you were under his protection, you were his. And the failure to protect her was a stain on his soul that could only be washed away with a torrent of retribution. "Find them," Bumpy said. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. The movement rippled through the club. Waiters froze, musicians missed a beat. Everyone knew. When Bumpy Johnson stood up with that look in his eye, the party was over. "Find every single one of them. I don't care who they work for. I don't care if they work for the Dutchman. I don't care if they work for the devil himself. Find them. And bring them to me." "And then what?" Junie asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then," Bumpy said, walking toward the door, the crowd parting like the Red Sea before Moses, "I'm going to teach them the difference between a gangster and a king." To understand the rage that consumed Bumpy Johnson in that moment, to understand why the death of a domestic worker would trigger a bloodbath that would make the papers from the Bronx to the Battery, we have to go back. We have to go back to the heat, the humidity, and the horror of the South. We have to go back to Charleston, South Carolina, 1915. Because the Bumpy Johnson who walked out of that club in Harlem wasn't made in New York. He was forged in the fires of Jim Crow, in a place where a black life could be snuffed out on a whim, and where the only law that mattered was the law of survival. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born on Halloween, October 31, 1905. A spooky day for a spooky man, they would say later. But in 1915, he was just a 10-year-old boy living in a world designed to crush him. He was small for his age, with a thick accent and a bubbling, volcanic temper that he couldn't quite control. But the event that defined his life didn't happen to him directly. It happened to his brother, Willie. Willie was older, accused of the ultimate crime in the segregated South, the killing of a white man. It didn't matter if it was self-defense. It didn't matter what the facts were. In Charleston, an accusation was a verdict, and the sentence was usually a rope and a tree. The Johnson family didn't wait for the law. They knew the law wasn't built for them. They mortgaged their tiny home, everything they owned, every scrap of equity they had managed to scrape together in a system rigged against them, to raise the money. They didn't use the money for a lawyer. They used it for a ticket. They sent Willie north. They smuggled him out of the kill zone, sending him to relatives in Harlem to save his life. Young Ellsworth watched this. He watched his parents sacrifice their security to save his brother. He watched the fear in their eyes, not of poverty, but of the lynch mob. He learned a lesson that day that would stick with him until he took his last breath at Wells' restaurant 50 years later. He learned that the law cannot protect you. He learned that the police are not your guardians. He learned that when the world wants to kill you, the only thing that stands between you and the grave is family, money, and the willingness to do whatever is necessary to survive. As Ellsworth grew, that lesson festered. His parents saw the change in him. They saw the insolence, as the white folks called it, the refusal to look down when a white man walked by, the clenched fists, the sharp tongue. They knew that in South Carolina, a boy like Ellsworth Johnson wouldn't live to see 20. He was too proud, too angry, too smart. He was a spark in a powder keg. So, in 1919, just a few years after saving Willie, they made the decision to save Ellsworth. They packed his bags. They put him on a train, a bitter irony, considering the train that would later feature so tragically in his story. And they sent him to Harlem to live with his sister Mabel. He arrived in New York at the height of the Great Migration. He stepped off the train into a world that was vibrating with energy. Harlem, the Mecca, the black capital of the world. It was 1919, the Red Summer, a time of racial violence across America. But in Harlem, there was a sense of ownership. But Bumpy Johnson didn't arrive as a king. He arrived as a peasant. He was a country boy with a funny head and a funny way of talking. He was an outsider. He tried to go straight. He really did. He sold newspapers on the corner. He swept floors. He tried to finish high school. But the streets of Harlem were a gauntlet. The local kids, tough, streetwise New Yorkers, saw the small boy with the southern drawl and the bump on his head, and they saw a target. They mocked him. They pushed him. They tried to take his corner and his dignity. But they made a miscalculation. They mistook his size for weakness. They didn't know about the Charleston fire burning in his gut. Bumpy realized very quickly that in Harlem, just like in the South, respect wasn't given. It was taken. He couldn't beat them with size, so he beat them with ferocity. He learned that if you hit a man with a brick, he falls just as hard as if you hit him with a fist. He learned that if you carry a knife, the big boys step back. By the time he was a teenager, the bullying had stopped. Not because he had grown taller, but because he had grown dangerous. He caught the eye of William "Bub" Hewlett, a local gangster who appreciated a kid who wouldn't back down. Hewlett saw something in Bumpy. He saw a soldier. He saw a kid who didn't fight to win, he fought to destroy. Hewlett took him in, gave him a job protecting the high, rolling gamblers of Harlem. This was Bumpy's university. He learned the geography of the underworld. He learned who paid, who didn't, and who needed to be reminded. He carried a jagged piece of metal, a lead pipe, or a knife. He earned his stripes in back alleys and pool halls. But unlike the other muscle on the street, Bumpy was reading. He was consuming literature, history, and philosophy. He was building a mind as sharp as his razor, and he would need it, because the 1920s were ending, and the era of the independent operator was closing. A new power was rising in Harlem, a woman from the islands with a temper to match his own and a business mind that rivaled Wall Street. Her name was Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the Queen of Numbers, and she was about to give Bumpy Johnson the keys to the kingdom. But keys to a kingdom are useless if the gates are being battered down by a barbarian. And the barbarian was coming. His name was Dutch Schultz, and he was bringing a war that would turn the sidewalks of Harlem red and lead directly to that train track, that Nanny. And the moment Bumpy Johnson decided that mercy was a luxury he could no longer afford, Bumpy Johnson didn't just walk into power, he was invited in by royalty. By the early 1930s, Bumpy had spent nearly half his life in prison for burglary, pimping, and assault. He was a revolving door criminal, a man with a rap sheet longer than his arm but no empire to show for it. When he was released in 1932, the country was in the grip of the Great Depression. Harlem was hurting. Jobs were scarce, hope was rationed, and the only banking system that the people of Harlem could rely on was the policy. The policy, or the numbers game, was the lifeblood of the community. It was a lottery, illegal but essential. You put a penny, a nickel, a dime on a 3-digit number. If your number hit, you got paid 600 to 1. For a washerwoman making a few dollars a week, a hit on the numbers meant rent. It meant shoes for the kids, it meant survival. The bankers who ran these games were the pillars of the community. They were the ones who had cash when the white banks downtown wouldn't even let a black man open an account. And the biggest, toughest, most brilliant banker of them all was Stephanie St. Clair. They called her Madame Queen. She was French Caribbean elegant, fiercely intelligent, and absolutely fearless. She ran her operation from a townhouse on Edgecombe Avenue, Sugar Hill. She published ads in the newspapers calling out police corruption. She walked the streets like she owned them, because she did. But being a woman and being black made her a target. She needed a sword to go with her shield. She needed someone who understood violence not just as a tool, but as a language. She found Bumpy Johnson. He was fresh out of prison, broke, but radiating that quiet menace that separates the wolves from the sheep. St. Clair saw past the rough edges. She saw the intellect. She saw the loyalty. She hired him as her bodyguard and chief enforcer. It was a partnership that would change the face of organized crime. Bumpy wasn't just a thug for St. Clair. He was a student. She taught him the business. She taught him how to count the money, how to manage the runners, how to buy the cops, and how to hold the community's respect. But success breeds envy, and in the underworld, envy breeds war. Downtown, the white mobsters were watching. For years, the Italian and Jewish syndicates had ignored Harlem. They thought the nickels and dimes of black folks weren't worth the effort. They were busy bootlegging liquor and running unions. But with the end of Prohibition, the liquor money dried up. Suddenly, those nickels and dimes in Harlem looked like millions of dollars. Because they were. Enter Arthur Flegenheimer, better known as Dutch Schultz. The Dutchman. He was a psychopath, a beer baron from the Bronx who killed with the casual indifference of a man swatting a fly. He looked at Harlem and saw a gold mine that was unguarded. He decided he was going to take the numbers racket. He didn't ask, he invaded. Schultz sent his men uptown with an ultimatum for the independent bankers: turn over your operations to the Dutchman, pay a percentage of the cut, or die. Most of the bankers, terrified of Schultz's reputation and his army of gunmen, folded. They handed over their books. They took the knee. But Madame St. Clair, she looked at the ultimatum, she looked at the Dutchman's thugs, and she spat. I'm not paying a white man to run my business in my neighborhood, she declared. It was a death sentence, or it should have been. But she had Bumpy. The war that followed was unlike anything New York had seen. It was David versus Goliath. If David carried a sawed-off shotgun and Goliath had the NYPD in his pocket. Schultz had the numbers, the money, and the political protection. He had the cops on his payroll arresting St. Clair's runners, raiding her banks, harassing her at every turn. But Bumpy Johnson had Harlem. This is where the guerrilla tactics came into play. Bumpy knew he couldn't fight Schultz in a pitched battle. He didn't have the manpower. So he fought a war of shadows. He utilized the terrain. Bumpy's crew was small, only 9 trusted men. But they were ghosts. They knew every alley, every rooftop, every cellar in Harlem. Schultz's men stuck out like sore thumbs. They were white men in expensive suits walking into a black neighborhood they didn't understand. Bumpy's crew would spot them crossing 110th Street. They would track them, and then they would strike. Bumpy perfected the hit and run. A Schultz bagman collecting money would find himself surrounded, stripped of his cash and his dignity, and sent back downtown with a message: tell the Dutchman to stay out of Harlem. When Schultz escalated, sending hit squads to kill St. Clair, Bumpy escalated back. Bodies began to drop. Over 40 murders were attributed to this war. Bumpy Johnson moved through the violence like a shark in water. He was everywhere and nowhere. He utilized the drop. He would drop down from fire escapes behind Schultz's enforcers. He used the swift. He was fast with a knife, faster than they were with guns in close quarters. And he used the psychological weapon of no mercy. If you came for the queen, you didn't just get beaten, you got erased. But Schultz was relentless. He was losing money, losing face, and he was enraged. He couldn't catch Bumpy. He couldn't kill St. Clair. So he decided to change the rules. He decided to target the soft underbelly of the operation. If he couldn't kill the king and queen, he would kill the castle. This brings us back to the train. The war had dragged on. Schultz was getting desperate. His political protection was fraying because the body count was getting too high for City Hall to ignore. He needed a win. He needed to break Bumpy's spirit. He ordered his men to target the household, not the soldiers, the civilians. The nanny worked for the Johnson household during a time when Bumpy was trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy for his family. She was an innocent, a woman who simply cared for children. She was traveling, likely running an errand or visiting family, taking the train upstate. Schultz's men had been tracking the family's movements, looking for an opening. They found her alone in a car. They cornered her. They didn't want money. They wanted to send a message that nowhere was safe. Not a train, not a home, not a nursery. By throwing her from that train, they believed they were demonstrating ultimate power. They were saying, we can touch anyone you love. We can reach into your home and pull them out and destroy them. When Bumpy sat in that club with Junie Bird and heard the news, the war changed. It stopped being about business. It stopped being about territory or percentages or the numbers game. It became about blood. They think this makes them strong, Bumpy said to Junie, his voice devoid of any inflection, which was the scariest sound Junie had ever heard. They think killing a woman makes them gangsters. It just makes them dead. Bumpy stood up. Get the crew. Get Willie Fish. Get Quick Lewis. We aren't collecting numbers today. We aren't dodging the cops. Today, we go hunting. The investigation was swift. It had to be. Bumpy utilized the entire ecosystem of Harlem. He went to the homeless men who slept near the train tracks. He went to the porters who worked the rail lines. He went to the street urchins who saw everything and said nothing, until Bumpy asked. He found out who was on the train. He found out which of Schultz's enforcers had been bragging about teaching the knee, or a lesson. It was a crew of 4 men, hard men. Killers who thought they were untouchable because they were white and worked for the Dutchman. They were holed up in a safe house in the Bronx, thinking they were out of range. They were wrong. Bumpy didn't send a hit squad. He went himself. He took Junie and a few others, but he was the tip of the spear. They crossed the bridge into the Bronx, moving out of their territory and into the enemy's backyard. This was a violation of tactical protocol, but Bumpy didn't care. They kicked in the door of the safe house at 3:00 a.m. The men were asleep or playing cards, confident in their safety. They barely had time to reach for their weapons before the room was filled with the shadows of Harlem's vengeance. Bumpy walked into the room. He didn't have a gun drawn. He held that straight razor. The same razor that was part of his mythology. He looked at the men who had thrown a defenseless woman from a moving train. You like trains? Bumpy asked. The men were silent, frozen by the sight of the black man who had terrorized their organization for years standing in their living room. You like to see things fly, Bumpy continued, stepping closer. You broke the rules. There are rules in this life. We kill each other. That's the game. But you don't touch the homin. You don't touch the help. One of the men reached for a pistol on the table. Bumpy moved. It was a blur of motion, the bumpy speed that defied his age and his size. The razor flashed. The man screamed and clutched his hand, or what was left of it. I'm not going to shoot you, Bumpy said to the group. Shooting is too quick. Shooting is mercy. And you didn't show her any mercy. What happened next in that room is the subject of dark whispers in the Underworld history books. Some say Bumpy made them fight each other. Some say he used the razor to mark them for life, leaving scars that would forever identify them as child killers and cowards. But the most prevailing legend, the one that fits the No Mercy title, is that Bumpy didn't let them leave that room alive. He executed them, not with the detached efficiency of a business transaction, but with the personal fury of an avenging patriarch. He left their bodies as a message to Dutch Schultz. The message was clear. You can have the politicians, you can have the money, but if you touch my people again, there will be no place on earth you can hide. This act of retribution sent shockwaves through the New York underworld. It wasn't just the violence, it was the audacity. A black gangster crossing into the Bronx and slaughtering white mobsters in their own safe house. It was unheard of. It signaled to the Italian families, the Lucianos, the Genoveses, that Bumpy Johnson was not just a local hood. He was a force of nature, and he was a problem that Schultz couldn't solve. This realization by the Italians would lead to the end of the war. Lucky Luciano, the pragmatist, watched the bodies pile up. He watched Schultz getting crazier, more violent, bringing too much heat. He watched Bumpy Johnson standing tall amidst the carnage, holding Harlem against all odds. Luciano did the math. Schultz was a liability. Johnson was an asset. So, shortly after the retribution for the Nanny, the commission made a move. On October 23, 1935, Dutch Schultz was gunned down in the bathroom of the Palace Choff House in Newark, New Jersey. The order came from the Italians, but the relief was felt in Harlem. With Schultz gone, Bumpy Johnson went to sit down with Lucky Luciano. It was a meeting of equals, or as close to equals as the racial politics of 1935 would allow. They met in a neutral location. Luciano, polished, scarred, the architect of the syndicate. Bumpy, dapper, intense, the king of Harlem. You fought a good war, Bumpy, Luciano reportedly said. I fought for what was mine, Bumpy replied. Schultz is gone. But we're still here, Luciano said. We can keep fighting, we have more men, we have more guns, or we can do business. Bumpy knew the reality. He had won the battle, but he couldn't win a permanent war against the 5 families. He needed peace. But he needed peace with dignity. Harlem is mine, Bumpy said. I run the numbers, I run the protection. My people answer to me. No Italian soldiers on 125th Street. No shakedowns of my bankers, and in return, Luciano asked, in return you get a peace, a tribute, we do business. But I stay the boss of my territory, independent. Sovereign, Luciano nodded. He respected strength, he respected intelligence. Done. And with that handshake, the peace with honor was established. Bumpy Johnson had secured his throne. He had avenged his nanny. He had defeated the Dutchman. And he had established himself as the undisputed godfather of Harlem. But winning the war was just the beginning. Now he had to rule the kingdom. And ruling Harlem in the 1940s and 50s would require more than just a razor. It would require a heart, a mind, and a soul that could navigate the treacherous waters between being a hero and a villain. The peace that Bumpy Johnson established with Lucky Luciano in 1935 did more than just stop the bleeding on the streets of Harlem. It created a unique geopolitical entity within New York City. For the next 15 years, Bumpy Johnson was not merely a gangster, he was a gatekeeper. He became the lens through which the Italian Mafia viewed Harlem, and the shield that protected the neighborhood from the worst excesses of the downtown syndicates. Under the terms of their agreement, the Italians controlled the wholesale distribution of illicit goods, but the retail operations, the numbers banks, the protection rackets, and the day-to-day governance of the uptown streets remained firmly in Bumpy's hands. This was the era of the Pax Johnson, a time when the crime rate in Harlem for unauthorized activities actually dropped, because everyone knew that the penalty for breaking the law without Bumpy's permission was far more severe than anything the police could inflict. During this period, Bumpy Johnson cultivated a persona that baffled the authorities and charmed the community. He was a paradox wrapped in a tailored suit. On one hand, he was a ruthless killer who had secured his throne with a razor blade and a willingness to use it. On the other, he was a man of profound intellect and culture. He was a voracious reader, consuming philosophy, history, and literature with the hunger of a man who had been denied formal education by a racist system. He wrote poetry, some of which was published in the journals of the Harlem Renaissance, capturing the rhythm, the pain, and the vibrant beauty of the black experience in America. He was known to play chess at a master level, often engaging in matches with the Reverend Dr. John Howard Johnson of St. Martin's Episcopal Church, discussing theology and social justice over the checkered board while his lieutenants collected the day's receipts from the policy banks. This duality earned him the title of a Renaissance gangster. He was refined and classy, moving through the world with the grace of a businessman rather than the swagger of a thug. He became a Robin Hood figure to the poor of Harlem. During the holidays, He was a fixture on the streets, personally overseeing the distribution of turkeys and meals to families who had nothing. He paid rents for widows. He funded scholarships for bright children who had no other way to get to college. This wasn't just charity, it was a strategy. By weaving himself into the fabric of the community's survival, Bumpy Johnson ensured that he was insulated by a wall of silence. No one in Harlem would testify against the man who had put food on their table when the government had turned its back. But the world was changing. As the 1940s bled into the 1950s, the nature of the racket began to shift. The numbers game, a relatively benign form of gambling that functioned as a community bank, began to be overshadowed by a darker, more lucrative commodity heroin. The Italian families, particularly the Genovese clan with whom Bumpy was allied, saw the immense profit potential in narcotics. Bumpy was pragmatic. He knew he couldn't stop the tide of drugs entering New York, but his involvement in the trade would ultimately prove to be his undoing. In 1952, the federal government, tired of being outmaneuvered by local corruption and Bumpy's street-level insulation, brought the full weight of the justice system down on him. He was indicted for conspiracy to sell heroin. The trial was a media sensation, reported in the celebrity sections of Jet magazine, highlighting his status as a black celebrity as much as a criminal defendant. Despite his legal acumen and his community support, the federal case was meticulously constructed. Bumpy Johnson was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He was sent to Alcatraz, the Rock, the prison built for the worst of the worst, the men who could not be contained by ordinary walls. Bumpy Johnson became inmate number 1117. For most men, Alcatraz was the end of the line, a place where the spirit was broken by the cold winds of the San Francisco Bay and the crushing routine of maximum security. But Bumpy Johnson was not most men. He treated his incarceration as a sabbatical. He retreated into his mind. He read. He studied law. He played chess with fellow inmates, earning their respect not through violence, though everyone knew what he was capable of, but through the sheer force of his personality and intellect. There are legends about his time on the Rock. The most persistent is that Bumpy Johnson played a role in the famous 1962 escape of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. While the details remain shrouded in the fog of prison lore, it is whispered that Bumpy used his connections on the outside to arrange for a boat to pick the escapees up from the bay and drop them at Pier 13 in San Francisco's Hunters Point district. Whether true or not, the story serves as a testament to the reach of his power. Even locked in the most secure prison in America, Bumpy Johnson was believed to be a man who could make walls disappear. Bumpy Johnson walked out of Alcatraz in 1963. He was 57 years old. His hair was gray and the lines on his face were etched deeper by a decade of sea salt and concrete. He carried everything he owned in a paper bag. But his eyes remained unchanged. They still held that cold, calculating stillness that had made Dutch Schultz's hitman hesitate in 1935. He boarded a train for the 3-day journey back to New York, back to the city that had moved on without him. When he arrived in Harlem, he didn't go home to his wife Mamie. He didn't stop to rest. He went straight to the apartment of Junie Bird on the 145th Street. Junie was his oldest friend, his confidant, the man who had stood by him when the bullets were flying in the 30s. Junie was 63 now, but his loyalty hadn't aged a day. "Give me names," Bumpy said, standing in Junie's doorway, dropping his paper bag on the floor. Junie had the list ready. He had spent 11 years watching the streets, taking notes, seeing who remained loyal and who had decided that Bumpy Johnson was never coming back. He rattled off 15 names. Low-level runners who had skimmed profits. Lieutenants who had started taking orders directly from the Genovese capos. But there was one name that made the temperature in the room drop. Marcus Henderson, Junie said. The name hit Bumpy like a physical blow. Marcus Smooth Henderson had been his protégé, a sharp kid from 118th Street whom Bumpy had taken under his wing in 1947. Bumpy had taught him everything. How to count the numbers, how to pay off the cops, how to walk with the kind of dignity that made people step out of your way. When Bumpy was sentenced in 1952, he had handed the keys of the kingdom to Smooth. He trusted him to hold the organization together, to keep the Italians at bay, and to ensure that Bumpy's wife Mamie was taken care of. For 2 years, Smooth had done his job. Then, the money stopped. The letters stopped. Smooth had looked at the 15-year sentence and done the math. He decided Bumpy was a relic, a ghost story. Smooth had gone to Vito Genovese and made a deal. He gave up the locations of Bumpy's secret policy banks. He identified the cash houses. In exchange for betraying the man who made him, the Italians allowed Smooth to run 125th Street as his own personal fiefdom. Bumpy stood in Junie's living room, the betrayal settling over him. He didn't scream. He didn't throw things. He simply asked a question. Where does he eat? Small's Paradise, Junie replied. Every Friday night. Table 7. He holds court there like he owns the place. Shows up at 9 o'clock like clockwork. Bumpy checked his watch. It was Friday, 1600 p.m. Get me a table, Bumpy said, right next to his. June 10, 1963. Small's Paradise was the heartbeat of Harlem nightlife. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, the smell of fried chicken, and the sound of a jazz combo warming up in the corner. It was a place to be seen, a place where the elite of the black community mingled with the high rollers of the underworld. At 8:50 p.m., the atmosphere shifted. The door opened, and Bumpy Johnson walked in. He wasn't wearing the flashy suits of the new generation. He was wearing the same charcoal gray suit he had worn on the train from Alcatraz, scuffed shoes, and an expression that was impossible to read. He looked like an artifact from a different time. A hush rippled through the front of the room as the old-timers recognized him. That's Bumpy Johnson, they whispered. I thought he was dead. Bumpy walked straight to table 8. Junie Bird was already there, along with Willie Fish Jackson and Raymond Quick Lewis. 3 men whose combined age was nearly 2 centuries, but whose loyalty was absolute. They were the old guard, the survivors. Bumpy sat with his back to the wall, facing the entrance. An old habit. You never give the door your back. At exactly 9:00 p.m. the doors swung open again. Marcus Smooth Henderson entered. He looked every inch the king he thought he was. He was 38 years old, draped in a cream-colored Italian suit, a burgundy tie, and enough diamond rings to finance a revolution. He was flanked by 4 bodyguards, massive men who scanned the room with practiced menace. Smooth was laughing, shaking hands, soaking in the adulation of the room. He owned the protection for Smalls. He felt safe here. He headed toward table 7, his usual spot. He was halfway across the floor when he saw him. Smooth stopped mid-step. The laughter died in his throat. The color drained from his face, leaving it an ashen gray. His bodyguards, sensing the change in their boss, followed his gaze. They saw an old man in a gray suit sitting at table 8, staring at them. When they realized who it was, their hands instinctively drifted toward the bulges under their jackets. Bumpy didn't move, he didn't blink. He just let the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. Marcus, Bumpy said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise of the restaurant like a knife. Come sit with me. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. One of Smooth's bodyguards, a thick-necked enforcer named Leon, stepped forward, trying to earn his paycheck. Henderson doesn't take meetings without. Junie Bird stood up. He looked like a grandfather, harmless and frail, until you saw the .45 automatic in his hand. The man said, sit down, Junie said softly. In an instant, the room bristled with steel. Smooth's 4 bodyguards had their hands inside their jackets. Willie Jackson pulled a sawed-off shotgun from under the table. Quick Lewis leveled a revolver at Leon's chest. The jazz band stopped mid-note. Waiters froze with trays of drinks. Customers dove under tables. The entire restaurant held its breath. Bumpy ignored the guns. He kept his eyes locked on Smooth. Tell your boys to go home, Marcus, Bumpy said calmly. This conversation is between you and me. Smooth was shaking. He looked at his young, tough bodyguards, then he looked at the 4 old men at table 8. He saw something in Bumpy's eyes that terrified him more than the guns. He saw history. Go, Smooth whispered to his crew. Boss. Leon hesitated. I said go, Smooth snapped. The bodyguards backed away, their eyes locked on Junie's. 45. Until they reached the door. Then they turned and fled, leaving their boss alone with his past. Bumpy gestured to the empty chair across from him. Sit. Marcus Henderson sat. He sat on the edge of the chair, ready to bolt, sweat beading on his forehead. Bumpy signaled a waiter. The young man approached, trembling so hard the tray in his hand rattled. Bring us a plate of ribs, Bumpy said. The good ones. And 2 glasses of bourbon. The waiter scrambled to the kitchen. The restaurant remained dead silent. 250 people were watching a play unfold, and everyone knew the final act was going to be bloody. The food arrived. A steaming plate of ribs, glazed in sauce. 2 glasses of amber liquid. The waiter vanished. Bumpy pushed the plate across the table toward Smooth. Eat, Bumpy said. Smooth stared at the ribs. He looked like a man on death row. I'm not hungry, Bumpy. Listen, I can explain. Eat, Bumpy repeated, his voice dropping an octave. Because this is your last meal. The words hung in the air. Smooth's composure shattered. Bumpy, please, he cracked. I had to survive. You were gone. The Italians were taking everything. I made a deal to save the organization. You made a deal to save yourself, Bumpy corrected him quietly. You gave them my banks. You gave them my people. You told Genovese everything. And then you kept the money that should have gone to my wife. Tears were streaming down Smooth's face now, mixing with the sweat. I was going to make it right, I swear I was waiting for you to come home. I've been home for 3 days, Marcus, Bumpy said. You didn't come to see me. You didn't send word. You didn't send a dime to Mamie for 11 years. Bumpy leaned forward, his face inches from the traitor. You thought I was never coming back. You thought you got away with it. Please, Bumpy, Smooth begged. I'll give it all back, the money. The territory. Everything. I don't want it back from you, Bumpy said. I'm taking it back from you. There's a difference. Bumpy's hand moved to his waistband. The room flinched, but he didn't pull a gun. He pulled out a straight razor. It was the same razor he had carried since the 1930s, the razor that had carved his name into the pavement of Harlem. He unfolded it slowly, the polished steel catching the dim light of the club. You know what the Romans used to do to traitors? Bumpy asked, his tone conversational, almost academic. They'd make them eat their last meal. Then they'd execute them in public. Let everyone see what happens when you betray your emperor. Smooth was hyperventilating, his eyes fixed on the blade. I'm not a Roman emperor, Bumpy continued, but I am Harlem, and everyone in this restaurant needs to understand something. He raised his voice, projecting to the back of the room. When I went to Alcatraz, some of you forgot who built this. You forgot whose streets these are. You forgot that respect isn't something you take. It's something you earn. He looked back at Smooth. Marcus Henderson forgot. So now Marcus Henderson is going to help me remind everyone. Bumpy stood up. Smooth tried to bolt, but Junie was behind him in a flash. The barrel of the gun pressed into his spine. Stand up, Bumpy ordered. Smooth stood, his legs wobbling. Bumpy walked around the table until he was face to face with the man he had once treated like a son. With the entire restaurant watching as witnesses, Bumpy raised the razor to Smooth's face. He didn't slit his throat. That would have been too quick, too merciful. Instead, with a flick of his wrist, Bumpy cut a thin, precise line across Smooth's left cheek. Not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to scar forever. Smooth screamed, clutching his face. Blood seeped between his fingers, staining his pristine cream suit. That's so you remember, Bumpy whispered. Every time you look in a mirror, you'll see that scar. And every person who sees you will know what you did. Bumpy cleaned the blade on a napkin and folded it back into his pocket. You've got 24 hours to leave Harlem, Bumpy said. Take whatever you can carry, leave the rest. If I see you after tomorrow night, I won't be this generous. He turned to address the silent room. The rest of you, Bumpy Johnson is back. The rules are the same as they always were. Pay what you owe. Keep your word. Protect your people. Anyone who wants to test me, you know where to find me. Bumpy Johnson walked out of Small's Paradise at 9:47 p.m. He left Marcus Henderson bleeding into his expensive suit. He left 250 witnesses who would spread the gospel of his return to every corner of Harlem before sunrise. By noon the next day, Marcus Henderson was on a bus to Philadelphia. He never returned. Within 72 hours, the other men who had carved up Bumpy's territory had vanished or fallen back in line. The Genovese family, realizing that the cost of fighting a war against a man who commanded that kind of loyalty was too high, sent a captain to negotiate. The meeting lasted 4 minutes. Bumpy's terms were simple. Everything north of 110th Street was his again. Non-negotiable. The Italians agreed. Bumpy Johnson had reclaimed his empire without firing a single shot. He had done it with a plate of ribs, a straight razor, and the sheer, terrifying weight of his reputation. He proved that night that you can lock a man in a cage for a decade, but you cannot imprison a legend. The year 1963 didn't just mark the return of Bumpy Johnson to the streets. It marked a collision course with history. Harlem was no longer just a criminal playground. It was the epicenter of a social revolution. The civil rights movement was reaching a boiling point, and standing at the center of that heat was a man Bumpy Johnson had known long before the world knew his name. They called him Malcolm X. But Bumpy knew him as Detroit Red. Their relationship is one of the most fascinating and complex intersections of American history. It bridged the gap between the sacred and the profane, the pulpit and the pavement. They had met in the 1940s, back when Malcolm was a street hustler, a small-time operator with flaming red conked hair, running numbers and dodging the law. Back then, Bumpy was already a legend, and Red was just a kid trying to survive the jungle Bumpy ruled. Bumpy had liked the kid. He saw the fire in him, the intelligence that the streets hadn't yet managed to extinguish. But while Bumpy went to Alcatraz to serve time for heroin conspiracy, Detroit Red went to prison and found Islam. He transformed. He scrubbed the conch from his hair and the hustle from his soul, emerging as the fiery spokesman for the Nation of Islam. When Bumpy returned in 1963, Malcolm was at the height of his power, but also at the height of his peril. He was beginning to fracture from the Nation of Islam. He was speaking truths that made powerful men uncomfortable. Both white men in Washington and black men in the mosques. Bumpy watched this transformation with a deep, abiding respect. Bumpy was a cynic by trade. He had seen the worst of humanity. But in Malcolm, he saw integrity. He saw a man who couldn't be bought. And in Bumpy's world, a man who can't be bought is a man who is likely to be killed. The reunion between the two men was quiet, away from the cameras. According to Bumpy's wife, Mamie, the two men met shortly after Bumpy's release in 1963. It wasn't a meeting of business partners, but of two sovereigns comparing notes on a kingdom that was shifting beneath their feet. "You're walking a hard line, Red," Bumpy might have said, using the old nickname, the only man in Harlem with the gravitas to get away with it. "It's the only line worth walking," Malcolm would reply. By 1964, the danger surrounding Malcolm had intensified. He had officially split from the Nation of Islam. The death threats weren't just whispers anymore, they were open declarations. His house was firebombed. The police, whom Malcolm had spent years criticizing, were not inclined to offer him heavy protection. This is where the code of Bumpy Johnson intersected with the history of the civil rights movement. Bumpy didn't care about politics. He didn't care about the theology of the nation. He cared about respect, and he saw a black man standing up for his people being hunted by his own. Bumpy made an offer. He offered Malcolm the chemet. In the language of the streets, this meant the full weight of Bumpy Johnson's protection. He offered to place his best soldiers, men who had gone to war against Dutch Schultz, men who knew how to spot a hitman from a block away, around Malcolm 24 hours a day. He offered to turn the Audubon Ballroom into a fortress. "Let me put my men on the door," Bumpy urged. "Let me handle the security. Nobody touches you while I'm breathing." It was a tempting offer. Malcolm knew Bumpy's capabilities. He knew that if Bumpy Johnson said you were safe, you were safe. Bumpy's security detail didn't operate by the book. They operated by the razor and the gun. If they saw a threat, they neutralized it. No Miranda rights, no paperwork. Just no mercy. But Malcolm X was a man of principle, and that principle was his ultimate undoing. He looked at his old friend, the man who had survived decades of gang warfare, and he shook his head. "I can't do it, Bumpy," Malcolm said. "I can't have men with guns around me. I can't be associated with the underworld. It would destroy the message. It would look like I'm trying to provoke violence, not end it." Malcolm believed that his movement had to remain pure. He believed that accepting the protection of a known gangster, even one as respected as Bumpy, would delegitimize his crusade for human rights. He chose image over survival. Bumpy was devastated. He was a pragmatist. To him, a dead martyr was useless. He argued, he pleaded, but Malcolm stood firm. He dismissed Bumpy's guards. He walked into the line of fire armed only with his words. On February 21, 1965, the inevitable happened. Malcolm X was gunned down at the Audubon Ballroom. The police presence was suspiciously light. The assassins walked in, did their work, and changed the course of history. When the news reached Bumpy, the sovereign of Harlem didn't just grieve, he raged. He felt the weight of the "I told you" so that he never wanted to say. He told his friend Junie Bird he was a fool. A beautiful, brilliant fool. He should have listened to me. I offered him protection, and he turned it down. But Bumpy's loyalty didn't end with the bullet. In the days following the assassination, as Harlem wept and burned, Bumpy Johnson went to work. The funeral of Malcolm X was not just a service, it was a statement. And statements cost money. Bumpy went to the businesses of Harlem. He went to the numbers bankers who were terrified of the fallout. He even went to the Italian wise guys on the East Side. He collected money. He didn't ask for donations, he demanded tribute for a fallen king. He raised a substantial sum to ensure that Malcolm X was buried with the dignity of a head of state. He personally delivered the money to Betty Shabazz, Malcolm's widow. He didn't want credit. He didn't want his name in the papers. He simply wanted to pay the debt of respect he owed to the one man from the streets who had risen above them. This episode reveals the true depth of Bumpy Johnson's character. He was a killer, yes. He was a criminal, yes. But he possessed a code of honor that transcended the law. He recognized greatness even when it walked a different path. And the tragedy of Malcolm X haunted him. It reinforced his belief that in America, power without the willingness to use violence is just a target. It reinforced the lesson he had learned in Charleston, the lesson he learned on the train tracks with his nanny. The only thing that protects you is your own strength. By 1965, Bumpy Johnson was 60 years old. His hair was white, his movements were slower, but his mind was sharper than ever. He had reclaimed his territory, buried his friend Malcolm, and stabilized the rackets. But a new enemy was pressing in, not a rival gang but the federal government. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics and the NYPD had Bumpy under constant, suffocating surveillance. They followed him to lunch. They sat outside his apartment at Lenox Terrace. They trailed his wife, Mamie. They harassed his drivers. They were trying to break him, to force a mistake, to find a reason to send him back to the cage for the rest of his life. For a man who valued dignity above all else, this was intolerable. In the old days, Bumpy might have solved a problem like this with a baseball bat or a switchblade. But you can't stab the entire New York Police Department. You can't shoot an agency. Bumpy realized that the war had changed. The battlefield was no longer the alleyway. It was the courtroom and the public eye. In December 1965, Bumpy Johnson decided to fight back using a weapon the police didn't expect from a gangster's civil disobedience. It started as a typical day of harassment. A police cruiser tailed Bumpy's car as he moved through Harlem. They pulled him over for a routine check. They made him stand on the sidewalk while they searched his car, finding nothing. They smirked. They prodded. They waited for the famous Bumpy Johnson temper to flare so they could slap the cuffs on him for assaulting an officer. But Bumpy didn't explode. He got back in his car and drove, but he didn't go home. He drove straight to the 28th Pressing Station house. He walked through the front doors, past the desk sergeant who looked up in shock. Bumpy Johnson, the most notorious man in New York, was walking into a police station voluntarily. He marched into the commander's office, or as close as he could get, and he sat down. "Can I help you, Mr. Johnson?" an officer asked, confused. "I'm not leaving," Bumpy said. His voice was calm, resonant, filling the room. "You want to watch me? You want to follow me? Fine. Here I am. Watch me." He staged a sit-down strike. He refused to move. He told them that their surveillance was a violation of his civil rights, harassment pure and simple. He cited the law. He cited the Constitution. He sounded more like a lawyer than a mob boss. The police were baffled. They ordered him to leave. "No," Bumpy said. "If you don't leave, we'll arrest you," the sergeant threatened. "Arrest me then," Bumpy challenged. "Charge me. Put it on the record." They arrested him. The charge was refusal to leave a police station. It was a farce of a charge, and Bumpy knew it. He wanted his day in court. When the case came before the judge, it was a spectacle. The prosecutor tried to paint Bumpy as a menace to society, a career criminal who deserved no sympathy. But Bumpy's legal team, and Bumpy himself, argued the principle of the matter. They argued that a citizen, regardless of his past, had the right to be free from constant, unwarranted government harassment. The judge looked at the evidence. He looked at the police logs showing the incessant tailing. He looked at the charge, refusal to leave a public building where he had gone to lodge a legitimate complaint. The judge acquitted him. It was a stunning victory. Bumpy Johnson had beaten the system at its own game. He walked out of that courtroom a hero, not just to the underworld, but to the ordinary citizens of Harlem who felt the boot of police oppression on their necks every day. He had proven that he wasn't just a thug, he was a man who knew his rights and had the courage to demand them. This incident cemented his status as the elder statesman of Harlem. He was no longer just the man with the razor, he was the man who could outsmart the law. It was a moment of triumph, perhaps the last pure victory he would enjoy. Because while he was fighting the police in the courtroom, a new generation was rising in the streets. A generation that didn't care about dignity, or poetry, or the old codes of honor. A generation that cared only about a white powder called heroin. As the 1960s wore on, Bumpy Johnson found himself navigating a world that was becoming faster, deadlier, and less refined. He needed young blood. He needed someone who had the hunger he once possessed in Charleston, someone with the nerve to execute orders without hesitation. He found that hunger in a young man from LaGrange, North Carolina, named Frank Lucas. The relationship between Bumpy Johnson and Frank Lucas has been mythologized by Hollywood, particularly in the film American Gangster, where Denzel Washington plays Lucas as the direct heir to the throne. The reality, as is often the case, was more nuanced. Lucas came to Harlem with nothing. He slept on floors, hustled pool and mugged drunks until he caught Bumpy's eye. There is a story that Lucas impressed Bumpy during a pool game where he stood his ground against a dangerous street tough named Icepick Red. Bumpy saw the steel in the young man's spine and took him in. For 15 years, Lucas served as Bumpy's driver, his collector, and his shadow. It was a master-apprentice relationship. Bumpy taught Lucas how to dress suits, not zoot suits class, not flash. He taught him how to tip waiters, how to talk to politicians, and how to spot a liar by the twitch of an eye. A shepherd tries to persuade the sheep. Bumpy told him, "A wolf just eats them. You have to be a shepherd who can turn into a wolf when the sun goes down." But there was a fundamental disconnect between the two men. Bumpy was a man of the community. His power base was the numbers game, the poor man's stock market. It was illegal, yes, but it was viewed by many as a benign vice. Bumpy had dabbled in narcotics and indeed gone to prison for it, but he reportedly viewed the drug trade with a certain level of distaste. He saw what it did to the people. He saw the zombies standing on the corners of 116th Street. Frank Lucas, however, saw only the profit margin. Lucas watched Bumpy operate and learned the mechanics of power, but he lacked Bumpy's sense of civic duty. Bumpy was the Godfather. Lucas wanted to be the CEO. Lucas saw the Italian stranglehold on the heroin supply and wondered why Harlem had to buy from the mob at a markup. He dreamed of cutting out the middlemen. While Bumpy was alive, Lucas played the role of the loyal soldier. He drove the Cadillac. He collected the envelopes. He watched Bumpy play chess at the YMCA and hand out turkeys at Thanksgiving. He absorbed the lessons of no mercy, but he stripped away the philosophy. To Bumpy, violence was a tool to maintain order and protect the sanctuary. To Lucas, violence would become a tool for market expansion. There is a poignant irony in their relationship. Bumpy Johnson was trying to mold a successor who would carry on the tradition of the honorable gangster, the protector of Harlem. Instead, he was sharpening the blade that would eventually sever the community's artery. He was training the man who would flood Harlem with blue magic, a brand of heroin so pure and so cheap that it would devastate the very neighborhood Bumpy had spent 40 years defending. The generational clash was silent but palpable. Bumpy represented the old Harlem jazz clubs, tuxedos, the numbers racket, and a code of silence. Lucas represented the coming storm: Vietnam, pure heroin, superfly fashion, and a level of addiction that would turn Harlem into a wasteland in the 1970s. In the twilight of his life, Bumpy must have sensed this shift. He must have looked at Lucas and seen the future, cold, efficient, and utterly ruthless. The no-mercy doctrine he had perfected to protect his nanny and his home was about to be repurposed for a trade that showed no mercy to anyone, least of all the black community. By the summer of 1968, Bumpy Johnson was tired. His heart, which had pumped the blood of a fighter for 62 years, was failing. He was under yet another federal indictment, this time for a drug conspiracy that carried a potential life sentence. The law was closing in, the streets were changing, and the body was quitting. July 7, 1968. It was a humid night in Harlem. The air was thick with the heat of the city and the simmering tension of a summer that had already seen the death of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. Bumpy didn't hide in his apartment. He went out. He went to Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue, a legendary soul food spot where the elite of Black America mingled with the elite of the Underworld. It was 2:00 a.m. The place was buzzing. Bumpy sat at his favorite table. He was with Junie Bird, his oldest friend, the man who had stood beside him since the days of the Dutch-Schultz War. He was also accompanied by Finbar Watson and a few other loyalists. The waitress came over. She knew him. Everyone knew him. He ordered his favorite, a chicken leg, hominy grits, and a coffee. It was simple food. Southern food, the food of Charleston. The food arrived. Bumpy picked up the chicken leg. He smiled at Junie. Maybe he was thinking about the old days. Maybe he was thinking about the nanny on the train and the justice he had served. Maybe he was thinking about the poetry he had written in the solitary confinement of Alcatraz. Then the pain hit. It wasn't a bullet. It wasn't a knife. It was his own heart, finally rebelling against the strain of being Bumpy Johnson. He clutched his chest. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of sudden, crushing realization. He collapsed. Panic erupted in the restaurant. "Bumpy's down! Bumpy's down!" Junie Bird caught him. He held his friend, the sovereign of Harlem, in his arms. The man who had terrified the Mafia, who had defied the federal government, who had walked through the fires of hell and come out with a pressed suit, was fading. Junie, he might have whispered, or perhaps he said nothing at all. They called an ambulance. They rushed him to Harlem Hospital. But it was too late. The king was dead. The news hit Harlem like a physical blow. It traveled from 125th Street to Sugar Hill, from the pool halls to the churches. Bumpy Johnson was dead. His funeral was a spectacle fit for royalty. Thousands of people lined the streets. They weren't just gangsters and hustlers. They were grandmothers whose rent he had paid, students whose tuition he had covered, families who had eaten because of his turkeys. They wept for the man the newspapers called a monster, but whom they knew as a guardian. He was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. But he left behind a vacuum that would never be filled. With Bumpy gone, the dam broke. The peace he had negotiated with the Italians fractured. Frank Lucas and others like Nicky Barnes stepped into the void, unleashing a chaotic, violent free-for-all for control of the heroin trade. The no-mercy code, once used to protect the home, became a weapon of mass destruction against the community. The death of Bumpy Johnson was the death of the old Harlem. It was the end of the era where a criminal could also be a hero, where a gangster could be a poet, and where a man could rule a kingdom with nothing more than a razor and a reputation. He had avenged his nanny. He had protected his people. He had lived by the code. And in the end, he died as he lived, at the table, surrounded by his own, the undisputed sovereign of Harlem.